Today we're going to talk about promise, what a promise means. You think about promise. When I was studying for this and preparing for this and thinking about it, I began to think about that idea of promise from the standpoint of the character of the promiser. And I have to say that the character behind the promiser, it's one of the most, I'd say, important definitions of a person's character. Not the only one, of course, but the ability to make a promise and keep a promise. And you think about even between human beings, it really is in a lot of ways at the basis of our interrelationships. The promises that exist between us. I mean, you think about, for example, obviously the vows that people make when they get married are a promise. They're a series of promises. When you go to work at a job, it's a series of implicit promises. Your employer is promising to pay you money in exchange for you doing work for them. And there's a promise both ways. They're promising to pay you money and you're promising to work. In many ways, almost, even from the business standpoint, there's inherent promises in almost everything that we do. You go and you buy a car, and they lend you money to go buy the car with the promise that you're going to pay it back. Or buy a house, or the same thing. And even to some degree, our relationships as friends and loved ones, there's this basis of this sort of unspoken promise that we are meeting each other's needs, or being there for each other, or being the person that we claim to be. And it isn't the only characteristic, but it is one of, if you really think about it and get down to the basics, it's one of the defining characteristics of character, of human relations. And it's also one of the ways that we can define, for lack of a better term, bad character. When someone breaks a promise, when someone betrays a trust, that's a sign of bad character. And we're just talking about human relations. So what we're going to talk about today, though, has to do with God's promise, God's promises. When we think about the Word of God, not just the way we use it as shorthand for the Bible overall, but also thinking about it as what it really is, which is a whole series of writings. It is essentially God's words in the sense of the actual words that he says, not the collective Bible, are a series of promises that he makes to humanity. And that really defines our relationship with God, is God's promises to us. Rarely does it have anything to do with our promises to him, because of our weakness as human beings. We're incapable of keeping our own promises most of the time. So our relationship with God is really defined by his promises to us. And so, as a result of that, one of the things that define God's character is how he deals with the promises that he makes. In other words, the Bible says that we should have faith in him. Well, faith or trust, which is what it essentially means, is something that's earned. So the question then becomes, has God earned our trust? Has He earned our faith? Is He trustworthy? And the way that we define that is, does He, can He, will He keep His promise to us? And so it's really, in many ways, along with love and grace, promise is at the essence of God's character. And so that's what the author of Hebrews is going to be talking about now, beginning in verse 13. Because what he's going to do is he's going to start developing this, this case for the surety of God's promise. And he's going to spend a lot of time talking about what God's promise means, what God's oath means. And there's a reason, because he's going to be leading up to, and I'm jumping ahead a little bit, of course, but I want you to see kind of where he's going. It's not just, he's not just picking this subject just for a random theological discussion. He's leading up to, in chapter 7, the discussion of Christ as the priest after the order of Melchizedek. But that's part of the greater picture of Christ being our great high priest, which leads to the priestly work of Christ, which leads to what he ultimately is, trying to accomplish for us, and that is that through faith we can be redeemed. And like I said, I'm jumping ahead a little bit, but in chapter 9, speaking of Christ, it says, He has appeared once for all at the end of the ages to do away with sin by the sacrifice of Himself. So that is the ultimate promise that He's leading up to, okay, in this discussion. So he begins talking about what a promise is, or what God's promise is, and what it means, and whether or not there's evidence that we can have confidence in that promise as the basis of our faith in Him. And then that will lead us through this case of Christ as the great high priest, and then what He accomplishes, what He is, the fact that it's the culmination of God's promise to us. So that's the greater picture of why he brings the subject up. So today we're going to look at verses 13 through 15, and he's going to begin by demonstrating an oath or a promise that God made in the past, and use that as the basis to go forward with the promise that He makes to us. Because we can say, when we talk about is somebody trustworthy, worthy of our trust, one test of that is, what have they done in the past? Have they kept promises in the past? And so that's why he starts with a promise God made in the past. So in verse 13, he says, when God made His promise to Abraham, since there was no one greater for him to swear by, He swore by Himself. So he's talking about, then he brings up, makes reference to this promise that God made to Abraham. Now I want to talk about the word promise itself. The Greek term epigelo, or epigelo, I guess is how the proper pronunciation. In the Greek, this is a legal term. It's a compound word. It literally means to announce upon. If you the A-G-E-L-L-O part of that word is where we get the English word angel from. Angel means a messenger. That's what that agelo or agalo means, is a messenger. And it was brought into English angel to represent, that's what an angel is, a messenger of God. And the epi in the beginning of it, which is the prefix, means around or upon. It's a preposition. So what it literally meant in the legal sense, it was used to refer to a summons. the idea that, it's an announcement that carries authority. I'm announcing to you that you have to come to court. That's kind of the way it was used in the legal sense. A command from a court upon a person. But outside of the legal system, in more of a common sense, it meant to have an undertaking to do something, a commitment to do something, and therefore a promise. But it kind of has within it this idea of an authoritative backing. So, God made a promise to Abraham. Well, what were the circumstances surrounding this promise to Abraham? Well, the author of Hebrews just sort of references it, but we know what he's talking about. He's talking about Genesis chapter 22. And in particular, verses 15 to 18. Now, leading up to this, of course, you kind of have to even go back a little bit further in Genesis. I mean, you know the story, but I'm just going to briefly outline it for you. God first had made the covenant with Abraham in chapter 12, in Genesis chapter 12. And he promised to Abraham that he was going to make of him a great nation. We call that the Abrahamic covenant in theology. Okay. Now, what is a covenant? This is just a little bit more background here. The difference between a covenant and a contract. A contract, when you sign a contract, there is equal requirements for both parties. You sign a contract, if I sign a contract with you, Matthew, I'm agreeing to do something and you're agreeing to do something. And the contract can be broken if one of us fails to do something, okay? Covenant is different. A covenant is one way. A covenant is, I'm doing this for you, and it is unconditional. Nothing you can do will change what I've promised to do for you. There's nothing you have to do in return. It's a one-way, commitment. So that's what a covenant is. Well, in the biblical sense, I think we, to some degree, use it differently in our modern, in our modern usage. But biblically speaking, that's what a covenant was. It's an unconditional, one-way promise or commitment. So this was a covenant that God made with Abraham. So that means it was unconditional. He didn't say, I will make of you a great nation if. He just said, I'll make of you a great nation. Now, later on in chapter 15, verses 4 and 5, God, as you remember, promised specifically, even in his old age, that he would have an heir from his own body. And God fulfilled this promise in Genesis chapter 20, in verses 1 through 3, when Isaac was born. Now, I'm skipping a lot of stuff between that because we could be here for 6 months talking about the life of Abraham and all that went on, and I don't want to get too much down that rabbit hole. But suffice it to say, God promised he would make of him a great nation. He specifically promised you would have an heir from your own body. You and Sarah will have a child, even in Sarah's old age, which she thought was hilarious. And but he fulfilled this promise in chapter 20 when his son Isaac was born. That brings us to Genesis chapter 22. When God said, take your son, your only son, the one I promised you would be your heir, and you sacrifice it to me. And Abraham obeyed God and took Isaac with him up to the top of that mountain. And you remember what Isaac said. He said, we have the wood, we have, the knife, we have all the things to make the sacrifice, but we don't have the sacrifice. And Abraham said, God will provide the sacrifice. And then when they got up there, he tied Abraham to the altar, and he lifted the knife to sacrifice it, and God stopped it. In verse 11 of chapter 22. God stopped him and instead provided the sacrifice, provided a ram that had his horns stuck in the bushes. And because Abraham obeyed God and did not withhold his son, God made this promise to him. So, what was the promise? Well, first of all, I want to say that the author of Hebrews added this additional little commentary. Since there was no one greater to swear by, he swore by himself. I probably at this point would be helpful to actually read where it says that in Genesis chapter 22. Verse 15. The angel of the Lord called to Abraham from heaven a second time. The first time was telling him to stop, I swear by myself, declares the Lord, that because you have done this and have not withheld your son, your only son, I will surely bless you. Now I'll come back to the details in a second. So he said he swore by himself. So why did he do that? Well, the author of Hebrews kind of delves into this. He says there was no one greater to swear by. Now he's going to, in verse 16, which will be probably next week, he goes into more detail about why this matters. But for now, he simply points out the obvious. There is no one greater than God to make an oath to. And this is significant because when you talk about making an official oath, we always do that. Even today, we do that by swearing by someone. That's why when you get sworn in court, you say, I swear, with your hand on the Bible, so help me God. They say, when the president says his oath of office, he does it with his hand on the Bible, so help me God. The whole idea of swearing by someone or based on the authority of someone higher than you. Well, God makes an oath. Who can he swear by? There's no one of greater authority to provide the surety of the promise. Okay, because that's kind of the unspoken thing when you swear an oath and say, "So help me God." What you're essentially saying is, if I break this oath, that God kill me. God strike me down if I lie. That's essentially what you're saying. Is that the one you're swearing by has the authority to punish you for breaking that oath. That's the essence of why you do it. Well, God swears an oath. There's no one of greater authority to provide that surety. There's no one of greater power to enforce the promise. There's no one of greater resources to actually provide whatever it is that he's promising. And no one of greater love to be motivated to promise anything, because he didn't have to promise anything. So he swore by himself. He made this oath on his own authority. And, swearing essentially by his own name. I swear by myself, because there's nobody else greater. So, verse 14 is the covenant itself, what God actually swore to. And so, saying, I will surely bless you. That first word there, saying, it's the Greek word lego. I only point this out because there's, as we know, we've talked about it many times, there's a lot of Greek words for speech, for words itself, for the content of speech. We've talked about the word logos, we've talked about the word rhema, we've talked about the word laleo, which just means speaking in general. This particular one is another one that means to declare something, to pronounce something, to lay something forth in kind of an official way. It's almost like when the messenger, the angel and the messenger comes out and says, I'm pronouncing something from the king. This is what the word would mean to say, I'm saying something. I'm pronouncing it. This is kind of what the messenger does. Okay, it's a stronger word than just to say words. It doesn't just mean he was talking. It's meaning he's pronouncing something in an official way. And that makes sense because the context of this, God is making an oath. So therefore he's saying this, laying it forth officially. And this particular phrase, I love the way it is in the original Greek. It's the way the phrase is in the Greek, it's kind of doubly affirming what it's saying. He didn't just say, I will surely bless you. Literally, it is surely blessing, I will bless you. And that's the word surely there. It's another compound word. It looks kind of like amen. It's actually e-men. But again, that in itself is some kind of a double word. It means assuredly assuring. So it's a double affirmation of the assurance. So assuredly assuring, I will bless you. And the word blessing there, I point out, because you'll probably recognize the Greek term eulogio, and it's where we get the English word eulogy from. So when you think about a eulogy, what is a eulogy? Exactly.
A way to memorialize the person that passed.
Yeah. What you're doing is you're singing
You're
the praises.
pointing out their, yeah, so you're pointing out their good.
Yeah, you're pointing
traits.
out, when you stand up and give a eulogy, you're talking about what that person meant to you. You know, the good things that they did, what a great person they were. I mean, you're essentially singing the praises. Well, that's the word in the Greek that is usually translated as blessing. And it literally means to speak well of someone. That's what it literally means. It itself is a compound word. You can see logos in it. Logia, the idea of the content of speech, and the prefix having to do good or well. And so it means to speak well, to celebrate with praises. But the way it kind of commonly came to be used later was not just to sing praises of somebody, to celebrate with somebody, but also to sort of invoke happiness towards someone. So it could talk, depending on the context, it could be talking well about somebody, but it could also be talking to someone to, to invoke happiness upon them. I want you to be happy. And that's how we kind of think of blessing, is that we are pronouncing a blessing upon someone. So he uses, the way it's in the Greek is it's double affirmation, saying assuredly assuring, blessing, I will bless you. It's just like a double positive. You've heard of a double negative. It's like a double positive. But he does the same thing with the second phrase, giving you many descendants. Literally in the Greek, the phrase is multiplying, I will multiply you. And that word means to increase or abound. Just like with blessing, the words are doubly affirmed. It's increase upon increase. It's in a way, it's a play on words when you read it in the Greek. Blessing, I will bless you. Multiplying, I will multiply you. And the idea is just blessing on top of blessing, increase on top of increase. So it's just this enormity of this gift of God upon Abraham is what he's promising. Okay? So back to Genesis 22. In Genesis 22 we get a little more detail about this particular promise, and I think it's important for us to look at the details of it. I read this before, I'll read it again. I swear by myself, declares the Lord, because you have done this and have not withheld your son, your only son. This is the supreme act of faith here that God is rewarding and responding to. Trusting in belief that God saw in Abraham that he was willing to give back to God his only son, despite previously having the promise he was going to make him a great nation. But yet God was asking him to give up his only son. But Abraham did it. And so this promise is a response. He says, I will surely bless you. So he says specifically to Abraham, I will bless you. So it's directly a promise God makes to Abraham's life, to make his life a blessing and goodwill. But then he goes further and says, and will make your descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky and the sand on the seashore. Multiplying, I will multiply. The idea of this just enormity of this blessing. At one time, Abraham had no children. And now at this time, he only has one legitimate. I mean, there's also, the illegitimate son that he had with Hagar, or Ishmael. But he only had one legitimate son at this time. But because of his faith and obedience, he would now have a multitude of descendants. Millions of descendants. Then he says, your descendants will take possession of the cities of their enemies. This is a prophecy and a promise and a reference to the future promise of the land of Canaan. His descendants would occupy the land of Canaan. And then he says, through your offspring, all nations on the earth will be blessed. This is generally recognized as a messianic promise. This is a promise that the Messiah would come through Abraham's descendants. And this is why the author of Hebrews mentions this promise specifically, why he goes back to Abraham. Because what God promised to Abraham is the coming of the Messiah. And again, think about this in the greater context of why he's writing to these Hebrew Christians who are being tempted to fall back on Judaism, and that Abraham was the father of Judaism. But remember what God promised to Abraham, that he would send the Messiah. The Messiah is now here. He is the great high priest. This is the Christ we have now, he's going to say, is the fulfillment of this promise that God made to Abraham in Genesis chapter 22. He's linking these things together and saying we here in the first century, when he's writing to these Hebrews, are now seeing the fulfillment of this promise that God made. This is a promise of the Messiah. So now, going back to verse 15 of Hebrews 6, Abraham's receiving of the promise. And so after waiting patiently, Abraham received what was promised. And of course, that's summarizing an awful lot of the book of Genesis right there. But he expected his readers to know that story already. So he waited patiently. The word there means being long of mind. Like having a long mind, or like thinking long term is maybe the way we would say it in the 21st century. Having a long-term perspective, thinking long term. And the word came to describe endurance or long-suffering or patience or whatever. And so the idea is two things. It's kind of a compound word again. And it has, on one hand, the idea of the mind or the intellect. In other words, it's a choice that we make. In other words, it's not an emotional response. It's a thoughtful, reasoned, intellectual choice that we make. And the other side of it, long, the idea that we are thinking long, that we made a choice to think about the future instead of the now. If he had reacted, emotionally, then he may have made a different choice. So after waiting patiently, he received what was promised. It's important to understand that the word received there is a passive term. It's not something that Abraham manufactured. It's not something that Abraham created. Not to say that he didn't try. If you go back to Genesis, 16, clearly they tried to move God's promise along a little bit when they were being a little impatient. But remember, this is after that. Okay? And so Abraham had learned his lesson, I guess, by that time. And so he didn't try to manufacture God's promise. He just believed God's promise. And he made a mental decision to choose to wait. And his patience was rewarded, and he received what was promised. It was a gift from the promiser, God, who swore an oath. God kept his promise. Abraham had millions of descendants. Still today, he still has descendants today. His people inherited the land of Canaan, not once but twice. And the Messiah was given and obtained redemption for all who also believe God, as did Abraham. So, that's where we're going to leave it today. Next week, beginning in verse 16, we're going to talk more about why it was important, why it's important, the idea of someone swearing by someone greater than themselves, thus emphasizing why God didn't have to, because he's God. So we're gonna talk more about the importance of that next week.